Imagine waking up to a morning that feels ordinary, only to find your entire world shattered by the sound of horns blaring in the distance and longships crashing onto your village shore. By nightfall, families are torn apart, mothers and daughters are chained, and men are forced to watch in helpless horror. This was not a tale of fiction. This was the terrifying reality of thousands of women in 9th century Europe captured by the Vikings and sold as human commodities. Before we dive into this harrowing story, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. Would you survive such terror, or would you be captured like them? Keep watching, because the journey of these women is one of unimaginable courage, suffering, and resilience. The morning had begun like any other. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys. Children laughed as they chased each other across the fields, and women moved about tending to chores, collecting water, cooking, spinning thread, and watching over the youngest in their families. There was a sense of timeless peace, of life measured by the rhythm of the land. But beneath the calm, an unseen storm was approaching, one that would sweep away centuries of safety in a single violent wave. From the horizon, longships appeared like shadows of death sliding across the water. Their dragon-headed prows cut through the mist with terrifying precision, and the sound of clashing oars echoed across the bay. Villagers froze, sensing instinctively that these were no ordinary travelers. The Vikings had arrived. They were not merely raiders seeking treasure, they were hunters of people, and they had come for the women. Mothers, daughters, young girls, the very heartbeat of every household, were their most valued prizes. The first moments of attack were chaos incarnate. Screams pierced the air as villagers scrambled, trying desperately to defend themselves. Men raised axes and swords, but their efforts were futile. The Vikings moved with relentless efficiency. Women were seized first, often grabbed before they could run or hide, their hands bound, their cries muffled by the roaring waves and the shouts of their captors. Families could do nothing but watch as everything they knew was torn away. Children clutched their fathers' legs, crying, while mothers reached in vain for their daughters only to be pushed aside. Fear, the cold and paralyzing kind, settled over the village. Once captured, the women were chained together, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time, and herded onto the longships. The smell of salt water mixed with sweat and fear, a stench that would linger in their memories forever. Below deck the air was heavy and stifling, the darkness absolute. Many fainted, overcome by terror and the press of bodies. Some whispered prayers, clinging to fragments of hope that they might survive, that they might one day see their homes again. The voyage was brutal. Storms lashed the ships, waves crashing over the decks and soaking everyone on board. The constant motion left the women weak and disoriented. Food was scarce, and water even scarcer. Those who fell ill were left to suffer, for the Vikings did not view them as human beings, but as property to be delivered intact to distant markets. Every creak of the ship, every splash of water against the hull reminded the women of the danger outside, and the danger inside, the men who had captured them. When they arrived at the markets, their ordeal was far from over. Chained and presented like livestock, the women were inspected, evaluated, and sold to the highest bidder. Age, health, beauty, and skill determined the price, and once purchased, they became property, stripped of autonomy, of voice, of any rights. The foreign traders who bought them could command their labor, their bodies, and their lives without consequence. Families back home might never know what had become of their daughters or wives. For those women, life became a relentless struggle for survival. They worked in kitchens, in the fields, and within households, performing tasks from dawn until late at night. Some were subjected to sexual exploitation by their new masters. Escape was nearly impossible. Laws in foreign lands, geographic distance, and language barriers created an unbreakable cage. Every day was a fight to maintain even a sliver of dignity in a world that had stripped them of everything. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological torment was immense. The loss of home, family, and freedom weighed heavily on their minds. Each day brought reminders of what they had lost: the laughter of children in their village, the warm embrace of a mother, the simple routines of life they could no longer perform. Some formed bonds with fellow captives, small islands of comfort in an ocean of despair. These relationships were lifelines, providing support and brief respite from their suffering. Historians estimate that thousands of women were captured and sold in this way during the Viking raids. From Ireland and England to distant Arab lands, this network of human trafficking spread fear and misery across continents. The Vikings' raids were not just about plunder. They dismantled communities, destroyed families, and created generations of women living in bondage. Yet, even in the darkest moments, flickers of hope persisted. Some women learned to navigate their new surroundings, to barter for small freedoms, to find fleeting moments of joy amidst hardship. These acts of survival, however small, were testaments to their resilience. Each woman carried within her a story of endurance, a memory of her lost home, and a will to live against impossible odds. As the sun set on distant shores, the longships carried their cargo away, women who would never return home, women whose lives had been rewritten by violence and greed. This was the harsh reality of the Viking slave markets, a chapter of history often hidden, yet filled with human suffering, courage, and unbroken spirit. Imagine being torn from your home, your family, and everything you knew, sold in a foreign land where your name no longer mattered. What would you hold on to, hope, or the will to escape? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know which you'd choose if fate put you in their place. The journey began immediately after capture. Women were packed into the ship's hold, chained and pressed together, their movements restricted, their voices muffled. The scent of the sea mixed with sweat and fear, creating a suffocating atmosphere. Some women fainted immediately, others clung desperately to the few belongings they had managed to hold on to: a piece of cloth, a small trinket, a fragment of home. Conversations were whispers, prayers, or sobs. Every creak of the ship reminded them that escape was impossible. The first days were the hardest. The sea was rough, tossing the ship violently. Storms lashed against the longship, waves splashing over the deck, drenching those below. Some women vomited from seasickness, others were bruised and battered by the pressing crowd and harsh handling of their captors. Hunger gnawed at them, and water was rationed. The Vikings, ever efficient, did not concern themselves with comfort. They only wanted their human cargo delivered alive for maximum profit. As the days passed, a rhythm of survival emerged. Women took turns holding onto each other for support, whispering encouragement, sharing scraps of food. Small acts of solidarity became vital. One whispered a prayer for another's lost child. Another offered a quiet smile to remind her that she was still alive. Amidst the terror, these tiny sparks of humanity were a lifeline. Fear was constant. Every shout from above deck, every creak of rope, every change in the ship's movement reminded them that at any moment, a mistake could mean punishment or worse. The Vikings treated them as property, not human beings. Beatings were common, and any disobedience or attempt to resist was met with immediate violence. Women learned quickly to obey, to move silently, to suppress panic. Every act of survival was a careful negotiation between hope and fear. When land finally appeared, it was a bittersweet relief. The women's bodies had endured the strain of the voyage, but their minds were numb with exhaustion and anxiety. They were no longer in familiar territory. The markets that awaited them were alien, chaotic, and terrifying. Once disembarked, they were led in chains to open-air spaces where traders and lords would inspect them as though they were livestock. The market was a spectacle of human misery. Men, cloaked in fine garments, pointed and whispered, evaluating the women's age, physical condition, and appearance. Some women tried to meet their gaze with dignity. Others lowered their eyes, shame and fear mixing in a bitter cocktail of emotions. Mothers tried to shield younger girls. Sisters clung to each other, but no one could change the reality. They were property now, commodities to be bought, sold, and used. The process of sale was cruel and calculated. Prices were whispered, haggled, and sometimes shouted, depending on the crowd and the perceived value of the captive. Skills such as cooking, sewing, or household management could increase the price slightly, but beauty, youth, and health were the most desired attributes. Once purchased, the women had no recourse, no voice, no rights. They became the complete property of the man who held the coins. Some women were sent to nearby estates, forced into domestic labor for wealthy households. Others were shipped further abroad, even to lands across the Mediterranean. The journey had not ended, it had only transformed into a new prison, with rules even more rigid and consequences more severe. Every day required obedience, vigilance, and courage. Every interaction could be dangerous, and escape was virtually impossible. Despite the horrors, a few small lights remained. Some women formed bonds with fellow captives, exchanging stories of home, memories of families, fragments of laughter. These relationships became sources of strength, reminding them that even in captivity, humanity persisted. These women would endure, not because of the mercy of their captors, but because of their own resilience, their refusal to surrender completely to despair. Historians have estimated that thousands of women endured such voyages, sold in markets across Europe and beyond. Their stories, rarely recorded in chronicles or annals, survive in fragments, references in letters, merchant records, and later accounts of Viking raids. Each woman carried the weight of loss, fear, and survival, but also a spark of resistance, a flicker of hope that one day they might reclaim a sense of agency, however small. The slave markets were not just points of commerce, they were mechanisms of control, fear, and power. Families were broken, communities destabilized, and generations of women were forced into labor and servitude far from their homes. The journey across the seas was a prelude to a lifetime of uncertainty and hardship. Even in captivity, these women maintained small acts of defiance, holding on to memories of their homes, whispering forbidden prayers, or quietly asserting agency in minor tasks. Every small choice was an act of survival, a claim to humanity in a world that sought to strip them of it. Some captives endured silently, others risked everything to fight back. If you were among them, would you choose survival at any cost, or rebellion even if it meant death? Share your answer below, because your voice might reveal more than you think. The morning sun rose over the open market, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Women were brought forward, still shackled, their clothes torn or soiled from the long voyage. Some tried to straighten their posture, clinging to whatever fragment of pride remained. Others cowered, overwhelmed by shame, exhaustion, and the knowledge that they were completely at the mercy of those who walked among them. Merchants, traders, and lords circled like predators, evaluating, pointing, and whispering, their voices mixing with the cries of the captive women. It was a world ruled by calculation and cruelty. Prices were determined not by kindness or need, but by age, beauty, and perceived skills. A young woman who could cook, sew, or manage household tasks might fetch a slightly higher price. Those who were strong and healthy were more valuable, while older women or those who had been ill during the voyage were often dismissed or sold cheaply. Mothers clung to daughters, whispering promises they could not keep, hearts breaking as their children were led away by strangers. For the women, each interaction was a test of survival. Some attempted to speak, to plead or beg, but such actions were rarely tolerated. A wrong look, a moment of defiance, or even hesitation could provoke a beating, a public humiliation, or worse. Survival depended on a careful balance, moving, speaking, and reacting in ways that minimized risk while preserving even the smallest measure of self-respect. Once purchased, the women were taken to the estates of their new owners. Here, the reality of captivity became fully apparent. Daily routines were grueling. From before dawn until long past sunset, the women worked without pause. Kitchens, laundries, gardens, and workshops demanded constant labor. Some women were placed in the service of powerful households, where they faced constant scrutiny, verbal abuse, and in many cases, sexual exploitation. Others were sent to labor in the fields, where the sun, cold, and unending work wore down both body and spirit. The psychological toll was immense. Many women were haunted by memories of home, the smell of bread baking in their family kitchens, the laughter of siblings, the gentle touch of a mother's hand. Now, even the simplest sensory memories became both comfort and curse, reminding them of the lives they had lost. Nights offered little relief. In the cold, cramped quarters of their new homes, Women whispered to one another in low voices, telling stories of home or praying for deliverance. These whispered bonds were lifelines, fragile threads of humanity connecting them to the past and to each other. Despite their suffering, small acts of resistance and resilience emerged. Some women learned to manipulate the rigid rules of their new environments to gain small freedoms, finding ways to cook a meal slightly to their liking, tending a small patch of garden, or exchanging whispered news with fellow captives. Each act, however minor, was a defiance of the total control their captors sought to impose. Each act preserved a piece of selfhood in a world intent on erasing it. The cruelty of the markets extended beyond immediate transactions. Families back home rarely knew what had become of the women. Letters, messages, or attempts to track them were nearly impossible. Generations of women became disconnected from their communities, living entire lifetimes under conditions they neither chose nor could escape. Yet the human spirit persisted, and many found ways to endure, even when hope seemed a distant memory. Over time, some women adapted to their roles. The shock faded into a grim routine, and while captivity never felt safe or fair, survival demanded learning the ways of the households or estates in which they now lived. Friendships formed, alliances were built, and small moments of compassion, sharing food, offering comfort, or simply listening, became precious commodities of their own. Historians estimate that thousands of women were sold into slavery during the Viking raids, creating a vast network of human exploitation stretching from Ireland and England to distant European and Arab markets. Their stories, often buried in fragmented records, speak of fear, courage, and enduring humanity. Each woman carried memories of home, grief for what was lost, and a determination to survive against impossible odds. Life as a captive was a world unto itself, a place where every breath, every movement, and every thought was measured against the ever-present weight of control and fear. Days bled into nights, each marked by relentless labor, constant surveillance, and the gnawing uncertainty of what each morning might bring. Before we continue, if you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment below. Imagine being placed in a household where every word and gesture is scrutinized, and where survival depends not just on strength, but on cunning, endurance, and hope. Keep watching. The story of endurance in the face of despair is only beginning. From the moment they arrived at their new households, the women were thrust into routines designed to wear down the body and the spirit. Dawn signaled the beginning of endless chores, hauling water, cleaning floors, scrubbing clothes, cooking over open fires, tending livestock, and serving their masters and mistresses with unwavering obedience. No task was too small or too grueling. No complaint was tolerated. Each day demanded precision, speed, and absolute compliance. Some women were assigned to kitchens, where the heat of the fires mirrored the pressure of constant expectation. Pots boiled, meats roasted, and bread baked under the watchful eyes of supervisors. A single mistake, a burnt loaf, a spilled stew, could result in harsh punishment. Others were sent to the fields, working from sunrise until dusk, their hands blistered, backs aching, and feet raw. Exposure to the cold, rain, or scorching sun offered no reprieve, and the threat of violence hung over every misstep. Sexual exploitation was an unspoken terror in some households. Young women were vulnerable to the advances of their captors, while older women learned quickly that resistance could provoke not only physical punishment, but further humiliation. Fear became a constant companion, but so too did a careful, deliberate strategy of survival, appeasing where necessary, retreating when possible, and finding moments of quiet resilience when alone. Despite the oppressive conditions, small acts of humanity and solidarity emerged. Women whispered encouragement to one another, shared meager rations, and swapped tips for easing burdens. A word of comfort, a discreet gesture, or a shared laugh became acts of defiance, preserving dignity and identity in a world determined to erase them. Many relied on memory to sustain them. Recollections of home, the scent of fresh bread, the laughter of siblings, the gentle warmth of a mother's embrace served as lifelines. These memories offered fleeting solace, fueling determination to survive, to endure another day, to retain the fragments of self that captivity could not touch. Time in captivity also brought subtle changes. Women learned the rhythms of their households, the preferences of their masters, the hidden corners where they could rest, the timing of chores to avoid unnecessary attention. Knowledge became power, even in the smallest forms. Those who could navigate these dynamics gained a degree of safety and occasionally a measure of agency within the rigid structure imposed upon them. But the psychological toll remained immense. Isolation, fear, and the constant pressure to comply gnawed at the soul. Nighttime offered little rest. Cramped quarters, harsh conditions, and the ever-present threat of punishment left women exhausted yet alert. Dreams of escape flickered, sometimes vivid enough to offer hope, sometimes cruel reminders of freedom lost. In some households, women managed to cultivate quiet spaces of personal autonomy. A small patch of herbs, a corner for prayer or reflection, or a hidden place to exchange whispered stories became sacred. These moments of personal control, however fleeting, reminded them that they were still human, capable of thought, feeling, and connection, even when treated as objects. Acts of resistance were rare but meaningful. Refusing to allow cruelty to break the spirit, maintaining solidarity with fellow captives, or finding subtle ways to assert personal choice were all small rebellions against a system built on domination. Each act, however minute, reinforced resilience, preserving the essence of identity that captivity sought to erase. Through all of this, hope endured. Some women clung to the belief that rescue or freedom might one day come. Others measured time by the small victories of daily survival. Over the months and years, the initial shock of enslavement evolved into a grim rhythm of endurance, yet the human spirit, remarkably, remained unbroken. Behind every Viking victory stood the silent suffering of the enslaved. But here's the haunting question. Do you think their voices still echo through history, shaping who we are today? Comment your answer. I read them all, and your perspective matters. Years passed in a blur of routine, labor, and quiet observation, yet the women held on to memories of home as lifelines, recounting them in whispers to one another, the smell of bread baking, songs sung by mothers, the laughter of siblings in sunlit fields. These memories were more than nostalgia. They were survival tools, reminders that life beyond captivity still existed and that their identities were intact beneath layers of imposed obedience. Friendships and alliances became essential. Women who had once been strangers became confidants, protectors, and teachers. They shared survival strategies, how to endure harsh labor, avoid punishment, and secretly claim small spaces of dignity. These bonds were fragile yet precious, forming an invisible network of support that no captor could dismantle entirely. Some women found ways to assert their will within the confines of captivity. Simple acts, tending a garden according to personal preference, improvising meals or caring for a fellow captive, became quiet victories. Even the smallest exercise of choice, though limited, was a reclamation of self, a subtle defiance against the system built to erase individuality. Stories of rebellion circulated, often in whispers. Attempts to escape, though dangerous, were a testament to courage. Others used cunning to manipulate household routines, gaining temporary freedoms or easing the burdens of work. Each act, no matter how small, reinforced the understanding that the women were not powerless. They were survivors, finding ways to endure, adapt, and protect one another. The psychological impact of captivity never fully faded. Trauma lingered in dreams and memories, a shadow over even minor joys. Yet resilience shone through. Those who survived often became mentors to newly captured women, teaching them strategies for endurance and, most importantly, for preserving dignity. Through this transfer of knowledge, hope was passed down, quietly resisting the cruelty that sought to annihilate it. As the women aged, they reflected on the lives they had been forced to leave behind. Some were reunited with distant family members after long years, while others never saw their homes again. Regardless, their shared experience created a legacy of endurance, a testament to the capacity of human beings to survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. History remembers them not always by name, but through fragments of records, oral traditions, and the very existence of descendants. Their stories, though marked by suffering, are also stories of courage, solidarity, and the unwavering determination to retain humanity. They remind us that even when stripped of freedom, identity, and comfort, people can preserve what truly makes them human: memory, compassion, and the will to survive. The Viking slave market was not a single place. It was a network, a beating heart of commerce that stretched from the fjords of Norway to the deserts of the Arab Caliphate. Towns like Hedeby in Denmark or Dublin in Ireland became infamous hubs where human lives were bartered like cattle. The scene was almost unimaginable: narrow streets thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and salt from the sea. Women, mostly young, some barely more than girls, stood huddled together, their wrists raw from rope. Traders called out prices, lifting chins, checking teeth, inspecting bodies with the same cold detachment one would give to a horse. Most of the enslaved were women and children. Strong men captured in raids often became warriors themselves, forced into military service, but women were far more valuable in domestic slavery. They were cooks, weavers, concubines. They were traded for silver, fur, or weapons, and many, too many, were sold into the Middle Eastern markets, where their European features fetched high prices. But what do these markets reveal about the societies that built them? That human lives could be currency. That freedom could vanish in an instant. That power was not just about swords and ships, it was about ownership of people. These raids and markets didn't just destroy villages, they reshaped Europe. Communities along the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and England lived in constant fear. Entire families were torn apart, leaving behind villages of widows, orphans, and scarred survivors. But there was a darker ripple too. The presence of Viking settlements, built partly by enslaved labor, changed economies forever. Dublin, for example, grew from a small settlement into a thriving trade hub under Viking control. Behind its walls, the lives of enslaved women powered its growth, tending fires, weaving cloth, raising children who were half Viking, half captive. And over time, this mixing changed culture itself. Languages borrowed words, traditions blended, families formed from violence, and generations carried both the trauma and the resilience of their enslaved ancestors. Yet not every captive was broken. Some resisted in silence. History rarely records their names, but whispers survive. Women who refused food, preferring death to servitude. Mothers who hid their children during raids, sacrificing themselves so the little ones could escape. And then there were those who endured, waiting for the moment to strike. Archaeological evidence tells us of women who carried hidden tools or left subtle marks, carvings on wood, prayers scratched into bone, reminders that they were more than property. Their resistance may not have been open rebellion, but survival itself was defiance. Every breath taken, every tradition whispered to a child, was a refusal to be erased. Here's the part history books often overlook. Enslaved women weren't just passive victims, they shaped the societies that enslaved them. A woman taken from Ireland to Scandinavia would bring her weaving patterns, her recipes, her lullabies. A girl dragged to the Middle East might introduce songs, words, or ways of dress. Over generations, these influences seeped into culture, hidden but undeniable. Even DNA carries their legacy. Studies of Viking graves reveal lineages that trace back not only to Scandinavia, but to the British Isles, to Slavic lands, to places where raids were common. The Vikings weren't just conquerors, they became unwillingly entangled with those they enslaved. Standing in a ruined Viking fort today, the stones feel heavy, not just with age, but with memory. Each wall whispers of voices long silenced, not just the warriors who built them, but the women who cooked their meals, raised their children, warmed their beds, women who had no choice, yet left invisible fingerprints on history. And that's the haunting truth. Without slaves, Viking power might never have reached as far as it did. The ships would have lacked labor, the towns their foundations, the trade its bloodline. Behind every heroic saga of Viking kings lies an untold saga of enslaved souls. Why does this matter now? Because history repeats itself when forgotten. The Viking slave markets remind us how easily a society can normalize the commodification of humans. And though the chains of the 9th century are rusted away, modern slavery still exists in shadows. By remembering the past, we honor the resilience of those who endured. We remind ourselves that freedom is fragile, that exploitation hides behind power, and that human dignity must never be treated as currency.